And there's no shame in the game if you have to go use it. But it's the first book in the New Testament, chapter 16, beginning at verse 13. I want to read these texts which record an event that occurred while Jesus was here. He was with his disciples. He was in a particular place in the land of Israel. And let's listen in on the story. Matthew chapter 16, starting at verse 13. When Jesus came into the coast of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they said, "Some say that thou art John the Baptist, some Elias, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He saith unto them, "But whom say ye that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered and said unto him, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed it unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Verse 20. Then charged he his disciples that they should tell no man that he was Jesus the Christ. That statement has always perplexed me, and I wish I had time to get into that, but it's just kind of profound how God operates. Verse 21. From that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples. Pay close attention to these verses, because you have a great example of something, a point that I'm going to make to you today. Verse 21, from that time forth began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day. Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, "Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee." But he turned, that is, Jesus turned, and said unto Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me, for thou savorest or understandest not the things that be of God, but those that be of men." Now you got to ask yourself the question, how could that be? Peter had been walking with Jesus over 3 years. You mean he didn't understand the things of God? You need to make a note of this, saints. I don't care how deep you think you are in the Lord, how long you've been walking with God. There are a lot of things about God you don't understand. There's still a lot of humanity in us all. And that humanity prevents us from seeing things from God's point of view. Just keep that in mind and keep yourself humble. Verse 24. Then said Jesus unto his disciples, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels. Then he shall reward every man according to his words." I think you need to highlight, underline that, circle that, whatever you do to make it stand out. Verse 28. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There are a lot of things that need to be commented on in this, but there are things we don't have time, and in context of the message I'm sharing with you today, it would just kind of add information that is not consistent, or should I say connected to what we think, the thought we're sharing. We just read from Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 28. If I had a title, or let me just say this, the title that I put on this today is simply this: Worshiping a Legend in His Own Time. Worshiping a legend in his own time. The question is then, how do you do that? How do we worship a legend in their own time? Let me begin with this question. I'm going to read off a list of people, and I'm going to say right now, you may not agree with this list. You may say, well, what about this person or that person? Yeah, we could, all of us can add names, take names away, disagree about, agree with. I'm not trying to get into who is a legend, who you think a legend is. I'm just using this as a kickoff point, as a comparison to the main idea that I'm trying to get across to us. What do these people, all of whom are considered to be legends, have in common with Jesus? Noah, Abraham, Moses, Samson, Elijah, David, Jeremiah, Solomon, Daniel, Mattanias, Maccabees. You may not have heard of him, but any of you who have done some reading as far as the period between the testaments, it was his family that brought purity of the worship of YHWH, or Jehovah God, back to the nation of Israel. Mary, the mother of Jesus, John the Baptist, the apostles Peter, John, and Paul, James, the servant of God, who was actually the half-brother of Jesus, the first pastor at the Church of Jerusalem, Martin Luther, I think all of you have heard of him, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. Oh, this is a controversial one, I know, but he is considered a legend to many people. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, the Buffalo Soldiers, George Washington Carver. Many of you have heard of him, what he did with the peanut, or what he showed could be done with the peanut. Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, those are household names. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Walt Disney. If any of y'all ever been to Disneyland or Disney World, he is the founder of that. John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Muhammad Ali, Aretha Franklin. Yeah, who hadn't heard of the Queen of Soul? Jerry West, that's going back for you NBA fans. Michael Jordan, raging debate, who is better, Jordan or James? Barbara Jordan, well, that might be one most people haven't heard of. But if you're from Houston, that's a household name. What do these people in this list, and whatever list you might come up with, and all of these you could arguably say are considered legends, what do they have in common with Jesus? The answer is simple: absolutely nothing. I'm going to say it again: absolutely nothing. They have nothing in common with Jesus. First of all, we got to determine what qualifies a person to be considered as a legend. Well, there are two standards that you can use. The first standard is pretty simple, and I think we all use it. A legend is anybody you see as one. So as I said, you could add to that list I just gave you. You could make up your own list, and who could argue with you? Because however you see a person, how should I say, whatever your idea of a legend is, you can identify somebody to fit that criteria. That's one standard that you can use, but there's another, much higher, much more subjective. Much more, not subjective, but it's going to require that they meet a set of standards. A legend, then, is someone who, by the weight of who they are and what they have accomplished, deserves to be considered as one. If we use this second criteria to determine who a legend is, then only one person who has ever lived, deserves to be classified as a legend. And that person would be Jesus. That's right, Jesus. And that's a raging debate, but that's without any argument. Hands down, nobody else can reach that level of qualification that he can. To be in common with Jesus is to say that they are or have achieved what Jesus is and has achieved. Think about this. He is God who became flesh, who in the flesh overcame the devil, overcame sin, He himself said, which one of you can accuse me rightfully so of any crime or of any sin? He was the perfect lamb, the spotless one. He was tempted in all ways as we are, yet we're told without sin. Not only did he overcome sin, but he overcame death. Because on the third day, when they went to the tomb to continue embalming him, the tomb was empty. The stone rolled away, and his grave clothes lay there, but he wasn't. He overcame sin. He overcame the devil. He overcame death. And he is coming to restore the order, the peace, and the goodness of creation. If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, we find that when God had finished his creation, it was very good. It was at peace. It was in order. Everything operated as it was intended to operate. You didn't have all the mess that we got today. There were no viruses. There was no evil. There was no hatred. There was no killing. There was no war. None of that stuff existed. Everything was operating as it should. In fact, it was operating so well, they didn't have to till the ground to cause stuff to grow. Think about that. It just grew on its own. It was self-maintained, so to speak. That's powerful. In the text, you hear about this place called Caesarea Philippi. There are two cities that have that name. One, Caesarea, referred to by the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. They had other names for it also. And then this one, Caesarea Philippi. These were cities that were refurbished and renamed by members of the Herod dynasty. That would be Herod the Great and his son Philip. They did so to honor Caesars of Rome, in particular Caesar Augustus and Caesar Tiberius. These two Caesars were considered by this dynasty instrumental in supporting their rule in Palestine, which was true. Both of these cities were dedicated, now this is key, both of these cities were dedicated, named as such during the reign, that is the lifetime of both of these emperors, not in memoriam. In other words, after their lifetime. Herod the Great named Caesarea by the sea after Caesar, while Caesar Augustus was in charge and living. The same thing with Philip. He named Caesarea of Philippi after Caesar Tiberius, while Tiberius was Caesar and living. Here's the point. A legend cannot be worshipped or honored in his own time unless he is living when so honored. I want you to hold on to that thought and think about it. You cannot honor a legend in his own time if he's no longer alive. And yet today, all over the world, thousands, you might even say millions of people are honoring Jesus, who is the only one who could ever be considered a legend given the more strict criteria. All over the world, people are honoring him. How is that possible if he's dead? We couldn't honor him in his own time if he's dead, because we believe and we know by the evidence he is not. When you hear about people being healed, people being raised from the dead, blind eyes being opened, people being saved, born again even, changed, baptized in the Holy Spirit, I don't care what manifestation is associated with the faith of Jesus Christ, when you hear about these things happening, that is proof positive that Jesus is still here. Because he is the one that did these things. Jesus himself said, God the Father has committed all these things into my hands. And these things are accomplished because he is the one that's doing them. Or else Jesus never would have told us to pray in his name or to act in his name. Because you don't pray in the name of a dead person. So what good would that do? You can't act in the name of a dead person, but that person has no authority. Who's going to back up his name? But when Jesus told us to go in his name, that meant he would be with us. In fact, at the very end, in Matthew chapter, the very last chapter of Matthew, he told his disciples, he said, all power and authority is given unto me, therefore go. He authorized them to go. Why? Because he is alive. I want you to hold on to that thought. You cannot honor, let me just rephrase that. You cannot worship, because that word worship is key to my message today. You cannot worship a legend unless they're alive. So how do you go about doing that? Before we get into these points that I want to share with you, let's look at the word worship, because it's always important to me, because words mean things. They may not mean things to everybody. People use a lot of words, and a lot of times the words they use don't mean anything, or they don't mean what they say. But words mean things. So let's look at this word worship. When they use the word worship in the Bible, they would not be thinking of it as you and I would. We had a time of worship in this broadcast, and most of the time when we think about that, we think about singing, praising, and stuff of that nature. But they would not have understood it that way. I'm not saying that may not have been a component, but that's not the first thought would have come to their mind. The word worship to them meant to bow. You read in the Bible where it says they worship before a king or before God. It simply meant they bowed. The word carries with it the meaning of laying prostrate down before a king or a person of honor or dignity. So in their minds, it meant to prostrate down before them. They would actually fall down before them on the ground and stretch out before them in honor, in respect. You see this in Revelation chapter 4, where it says the 24 elders prostrated themselves down or worshiped and cast their crowns at the feet of God. That's the picture, and I want that picture to be in your mind. The extension to that is to serve. What is worship, or who you worship? To serve. Write that word down, S-E-R-V-E, to serve. I want to give you 4 ways, and let me say this too, believers. We live in a time where, we just like to be loosey-goosey. Everybody just do what you feel is best and all. And to some degree, God allows us, like the Lord's Supper. He didn't give us specific times to take it. He didn't say specifically, you got to worship me on this day after the resurrection. The church habit was to worship on the first day of the week because it was resurrection. It symbolizes the day that Christ came out of the grave. And that's an important point. Nothing wrong with that. So there was some leeway there. But you will find throughout Scripture that God was very specific on how he was to be served. Under the Old Testament, he didn't just leave it up to the priests to determine how they were going to sacrifice something, not even how they were going to appear in his presence. He didn't just say, come any kind of way. He gave them specific garments to wear. And those garments were made of specific things. He gave them specific times to come and when not to come, and how they were to come, what they were supposed to present, and how they were supposed to present it. And we see examples when they didn't do it that way, death occurred. He said, this is how you should carry this altar, the Ark of the Covenant. And when a man innocently tried to reach out and keep the ark from falling over and breaking, he was killed instantly because he was not authorized to touch the ark. And David had to go back and rethink that thing, and the next time he tried to bring it to Jerusalem, he did it according to the Scriptures. In the New Testament, then, saints, we find a lot of instruction given to us in the New Testament where God gives us directions on how we are to serve him. I'm not talking about singing songs before him. One person may have on their heart to sing "Worthy is the Lamb," as Brother James did today. We played other songs, "He is Lord." All of them are appropriate. They're different songs, but they're singing to the same Lord. That kind of leeway is open, as long as we do it decently and in order. But yet, there we have a direction. We can't just do it any kind of way. James can't just come up here and interrupt me and say, hey, I want to sing this song right now. Or the Sister Deshauna can't come up, hey, I got another scripture I want to read. That's out of order. It's not decent. So God does give us direction, and he does give us guidelines, and we believers are required, expected to follow them. Do you realize we enter in every time we come together, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am also. Every time we come together, even in a setting like this, though we're not in the same place, even in a setting like this, guess who's in our presence? Or should I say, guess whose presence we're in? We must stop haphazardly serving God by our own choice, by our own decision. You have two decisions to make. You really only have one. You can decide to accept Jesus and follow him. If you accept Jesus, there is no decision whether I'm going to follow him. That goes with it. So if you're a person sitting over there saying, I've accepted Jesus, but I'm going to do things my way, you haven't accepted him. Hate to tell you that, but I'm just a pastor. I'm here to help somebody. I remember a message that a young man, brother in the Lord, that God blessed me to be able to minister unto, who was here, who's now ministering in another location. God has called him to a work there, but he shared this message with me entitled, Preaching as If to Help Nobody. And I wonder if we got more preaching like that than preaching